Chapter 1. The Rupture and the Mirror. Have compassion. Deep breath. Have compassion. Have compassion. Have compassion. I repeated this phrase in my mind like a desperate mantra as the 40-year-old man sitting across from me detailed the endless parade of people in his life who were, in his estimation, complete idiots. His name was John, and he was my newest patient. According to him, the world was an intolerable landscape populated by fools: the dental hygienist who asked too many questions, the co-worker who lacked urgency, the Apple technician who couldn't fix his laptop, and, most prominently, his wife, Margot, whose feelings he categorized as mere complaints. He delivered his monologue with a blindingly white smile, completely impervious to my attempts to slow him down or make genuine contact. When I tried to intervene, to pull him beneath the surface of his rant, he simply checked the clock, noted he still had 20 minutes left, and forged ahead. During my training, a supervisor once told me that there is something likable in everyone. It is a therapist's job to find it, to peer beneath the abrasive defenses and locate the vulnerable human hiding in the dark. I truly believed this, even when John had handed me a wad of cash at our first session and likened me to a hooker, a secret he was keeping from his wife. I felt confident that beneath his off-putting presentation, something beautiful would eventually emerge. But today, listening to him rattle on, he just seemed like an arrogant jerk. Yet as his rant echoed in the room, I realized something unsettling. His defensive, self-righteous outrage felt eerily familiar. I knew exactly how affirming it felt to blame the outside world for my frustrations, to deny any role in the existential play of my own life, because that was exactly what I was doing. John was using his anger to cover his pain, and I was doing the very same thing. What John didn't know was that just hours earlier, the man I thought I was going to marry had unexpectedly called it quits. I was attempting to focus on my patients, allowing myself to cry only in the 10-minute interludes between sessions, furiously wiping away my mascara before the next person arrived. I was a therapist, a professional who understood that change and loss travel together, but right then, all I could think about was my ex. The idiot. The man I will call boyfriend was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily decent human being. He was the kind of partner who would leave love notes on my desk, remember the smallest details of my day, and bring home 20 jugs of maple syrup from Costco just because he was making waffles. We were two working single parents in our mid-40s, navigating the complexities of merging our lives. Or so I thought. The rupture happened on a random weeknight. We were in bed, discussing movie tickets for the weekend, when a heavy, deafening silence descended over him. It was a silence on a frequency only a significant other can perceive, the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophe. When I casually asked if something was up, he delivered a sentence that defied my comprehension. He had decided he could not live with a kid under his roof for the next 10 years. I actually laughed at first, assuming it was a bizarre joke. I had an 8-year-old son. We were planning a life together. But boyfriend was serious. As his own teenagers were preparing to leave for college, he realized he wanted his freedom. He didn't want to wake up on weekends to the sound of Legos. He just wanted to read the paper. My shock quickly morphed into bargaining, then blinding anger. How could a man sleep soundly next to me for 2 years knowing I had a child, only to suddenly declare that children and his freedom were mutually exclusive? He insisted he still wanted to marry me, he just didn't want to live with a kid. It was the ultimate paradox. In therapy, when patients present me with impossible pick-and-choose scenarios, I bluntly tell them, if the queen had balls, she'd be the king. You cannot order up a human life à la carte. Boyfriend had tried to do exactly that, compartmentalizing his doubts until the very last moment, claiming he hadn't spoken up because he didn't want to be a jerk. By trying not to be a jerk, he had become the ultimate architect of my devastation. The morning after the breakup, I lay paralyzed in the fetal position. Being a therapist does not inoculate you from the raw, messy reality of being human. I called my closest friends, seeking the immediate, visceral comfort of having my pain validated. My friend Allison declared him trash, urging me to find a distraction, while my friend Jen, a fellow therapist, offered to set me up on a date in a few weeks. But I didn't want a distraction, and I certainly didn't want a date. I just wanted the pain to stop. When patients are in the grips of crippling depression, I tell them not to look at the whole distance they have to travel. Just take one step, then the other. That morning, I forced myself to take a step. I woke my son, made his lunch, dropped him at school, and rode the elevator up to my office. I sat on my own therapy couch, staring at the empty chair opposite me, waiting for my first patient, telling myself I was going to be fine. But the truth of my fractured state soon bled into my professional life. That afternoon, my patient Julie arrived for her session, sat down, and pointed out that I was wearing a pajama top. I looked down, mortified, to see the words "Namaste" in bed emblazoned across my chest. In my post-breakup haze, I had entirely forgotten to change my shirt. Julie was 33, an esteemed university professor who had come to me to figure out how to navigate a terminal cancer diagnosis she received shortly after returning from her honeymoon. At a time when she should have been planning for babies and milestones, she was planning her death. She had beaten the disease once, only for a scan to reveal a rare, aggressive secondary cancer. When she asked me if I would stay with her until she died, I hesitated, overwhelmed by the weight of the request. But looking at her, I knew I couldn't say no. When I admitted to Julie that I had put the pajama top on by mistake, her mouth twitched, and then she burst into contagious, uncontrollable laughter. It was the first time I had seen her laugh since she learned she was dying. We sat there together, laughing at the sheer absurdity of our minds and bodies betraying us. It was a profound moment of connection, but it also cast a harsh light on my own suffering. Here I was, devastated over a man who didn't want to look at Legos on a Saturday morning while sitting across from a vibrant young woman whose future had been violently stolen from her. My fascination with the narratives people construct for themselves began long before I was a therapist. In my 20s, I worked in the entertainment industry, navigating the glamorous but ultimately hollow halls of a Hollywood talent agency and later developing television series at NBC. I spent my days reading scripts, shaping character arcs, and orchestrating fictional dramas. But eventually, a persistent, undeniable thought began to loop in my mind. I just don't care. The fictional worlds, with their manufactured crises and neatly wrapped resolutions, felt incredibly thin compared to the quiet, desperate struggles of real people. It was that yearning for raw, unedited humanity that eventually pushed me to leave the television sets behind, steering me first toward medical school and ultimately to the therapy chair. I wanted to help people edit their real-life stories. Now, however, I was the one trapped in a narrative I couldn't navigate. 2 weeks after the breakup, my friend Jen suggested that I needed a space where I wasn't required to be a therapist, a place where I could completely fall apart. Finding a therapist when you are deeply embedded in the psychological community is a logistical nightmare of ethical boundaries and dual relationships. After carefully querying a colleague for a referral for a friend, I was given the name of a seasoned psychologist named Wendell Bronson. I called him, leaving a tightly controlled professional voicemail requesting a few sessions for basic crisis management. I assured him I came pre-shrunk and just needed a bit of help processing a shock. When he called back and offered me an appointment for the very next morning, a wave of the placebo effect washed over me. Just the act of making the appointment brought immediate relief. I packed up boyfriend's belongings in a box, convinced that tomorrow this wise, married, father of 2 therapist would sit in his chair, listen to my meticulously documented timeline of the breakup, and confirm what I so desperately needed to hear, that my ex was a certifiable sociopath, and that I was entirely in the right. Chapter 2. Snapshots of Resistance. The first time I sat in Wendell's waiting room, I felt the distinct, uncomfortable hyper-awareness of a professional who had suddenly crossed over to the wrong side of the couch. When he opened the door to greet me, I took in his unassuming presence. The neutral khakis, the comfortable cardigan, the neat beard. His office was a calm, reflective space. The soft, early morning golden light was slowly shifting across the room, illuminating the quiet dust motes hanging in the air. I wanted to project the aura of a battle-hardened clinician, a woman who understood the psychological mechanics of heartbreak and merely needed a brief tactical consultation. Instead, the moment I sat down in his chair, the dam broke and I began to weep with the messy, unedited ferocity of a child. Through my tears, I immediately tried to control the narrative. I laid out the meticulously gathered evidence against the man I thought I was going to marry. I spoke in clinical terms, diagnosing my ex-boyfriend's sudden departure as a profound character defect, an attachment disorder, an inability to tolerate intimacy. I was not speaking to Wendell as a patient seeking help. I was speaking to him as a co-therapist, presenting a watertight case file and waiting for him to nod in professional solidarity. I wanted him to validate my anger, to assure me that my ex was entirely at fault, and to hand me a quick remedy for the agonizing hollow in my chest. But Wendell did not nod in agreement. He simply sat there, observing me. Occasionally, he would gently kick his foot, a small rhythmic movement that drove me crazy. His silence was deafening, and in that silence, I encountered the initial, agonizing friction of true therapy. When people first come to therapy, they do not bring their entire objective reality into the room. They bring a snapshot. It is a tightly cropped, highly filtered photograph of their lives, carefully angled to highlight their virtues and completely obscure their blind spots. The snapshot leaves out the messy borders, the context, and any evidence of their own complicity in their suffering. For weeks, I had been waving my snapshot at anyone who would look, pointing to the image of a cruel man abandoning a loving mother and her child. It was a true picture, but it was not the whole picture. Wendell's job was not to admire my snapshot. His job was to gently pry it from my hands, force me to zoom out, and make me look at the vast, complicated landscape of the background. The resistance to zooming out is universal because expanding the frame means looking at our own flaws. It means acknowledging that we are not merely passive victims of a chaotic universe, but active participants in our own lives. For me, expanding the frame meant facing a terrifying truth. I was not just mourning the loss of a relationship. I was mourning the loss of an entire imagined future. In the therapeutic community, we often refer to a profound concept about the disorientation of unmet expectations. Imagine you spend months planning the ultimate dream vacation to Italy. You buy the guidebooks, you learn a bit of the language, you pack your best clothes, and you board the plane with vivid dreams of the Tuscan sun and ancient architecture. But when the plane lands and the doors open, the flight attendant smiles and says, "Welcome to Holland." Holland is not a terrible place. It has windmills and tulips and Rembrandts. But it is not Italy, and the sheer shock of landing in the wrong country is paralyzing. You have to go out and buy entirely new guidebooks. You have to learn a completely different language. You have to meet a whole new group of people you never cared to meet. The pain of a sudden, catastrophic breakup is the pain of landing in Holland. I had packed my bags for a life of shared weekends, a partner to help raise my son, and the quiet security of growing old together. I had mapped out my Italy. Now, standing alone in the unfamiliar terrain of Holland, I didn't want to buy new guidebooks. I just wanted my old itinerary back. Years ago, before I ever sat in a therapist's chair, I worked in the television industry in Hollywood. My days were spent reading scripts, shaping character arcs, and manufacturing neat, satisfying resolutions for fictional people. In television, pain is purposeful, dialogue is sharp, and crises are resolved within a 45-minute block. I left Hollywood because I grew exhausted by the artificiality of it all. I wanted to deal with the unscripted, complex realities of human beings. But sitting in Wendell's office, feeling the heavy, smoky atmosphere of my own unresolved grief, I deeply missed the convenience of a script. I wanted a writer to swoop in, delete the conflict, and fast-forward me to the happy ending. But human change operates at an agonizingly slow speed. The future we obsess over is entirely constructed in the present, and by obsessing over the Italy I had lost, I was completely blinding myself to the reality of the present moment. Wendell understood that I could not be rushed out of my grief. The beginning of knowing always starts in the dark. It starts by sitting in the quiet room, letting the golden light shift, and finally admitting that the snapshot you brought in is no longer serving you. It requires a profound, terrifying surrender. As the sessions continued, I slowly began to realize that Wendell was not going to fix me. He was going to sit with me in the rubble of my broken plans until I was finally ready to put down my defenses, look around at the unfamiliar landscape, and take my very first step in Holland. Chapter 3. The Anatomy of Grief. Grief is rarely a straightforward, linear process. It is a chaotic, unpredictable weather system that moves through a home, altering the atmospheric pressure of every room. In the aftermath of the rupture, The silence in my house was absolute and heavy. The most agonizing part of the collapse was not just my own hollow chest, but watching the collateral damage ripple outward to my 8-year-old son. Children do not possess the emotional stamina of adults. They cannot sit in the dark waters of sorrow for hours on end. Instead, their grief is episodic. They dip their toes into the icy water, feel the sharp sting of the loss, cry out, and then retreat to the safety of the shore, throwing themselves back into the immediate distractions of play. One evening, my son would be sobbing into his pillow, asking why boyfriend had vanished and if he had done something to drive him away. The next morning, he would be meticulously constructing a sprawling Lego fortress, completely immersed in the present moment. This oscillation was agonizing to witness. The guilt of having introduced this man into my child's life, only to have the foundation pulled out from beneath him, was a heavy stone I carried into the office every day. While my home was filled with the erratic, sudden bursts of childhood mourning, my consulting room was slowly filling with a very different kind of sorrow. It was an older, deeply calcified grief. It arrived in the form of Rita, a woman approaching 70 who carried the heavy, suffocating scent of profound regret. Rita was completely estranged from her adult children, a painful reality born out of a history of devastating parenting choices and an inability to protect them when they were young. She had spent decades painting herself into a corner of isolation, pushing away anyone who tried to get close. Rita did not just hate her life, she had actively decided to set a deadline on it. During one of our early sessions, she looked at me with chilling calmness and announced that if her life did not significantly improve by her 70th birthday, she was going to kill herself. There was no hysteria in her voice, only the flat, exhausted resignation of someone who had simply run out of road. As a therapist, sitting across from a patient who has placed a countdown clock on their own existence changes the entire gravity of the room. I was no longer just helping someone find happiness. I was desperately trying to help her find a reason to stay alive. This heavy atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the explosive, demanding energy of John. If Rita was imploding, John was entirely focused on detonating everyone around him. In his sessions, he took up all the available oxygen, complaining bitterly about the microscopic inconveniences of his week. He could spend 20 minutes raging about a deli worker who had the audacity to put mayonnaise on his sandwich when he had explicitly asked for mustard. It was exhausting to listen to, but a seasoned clinician knows that disproportionate anger is always a bodyguard. It is a loud, aggressive shield designed to keep the world at a safe distance from a fragile, terrified interior. Beneath John's abrasive entitlement and his furious obsession with other people's incompetence, I began to see the hairline fractures in his armor. He was guarding a tragedy he refused to name. He would hint at a deep, unspoken pain regarding his wife, Margot, but the moment I tried to gently pry the door open, he would slam it shut, retreating behind a wall of insults and intellectualizations. I understood the impulse to hide behind anger and intellectualization all too well, because I was attempting the exact same maneuver in Wendell's office. I sat on his couch and stubbornly mourned the loss of what I considered the whole package. I had convinced myself that boyfriend was the final missing piece of my life's puzzle, the man who would finally make the picture complete. I argued my case to Wendell, presenting the loss not just as a heartbreak, but as a cosmic injustice. I was exhausted from being a single mother. I was supposed to have a partner now. Wendell listened patiently, allowing my frantic narratives to run their course before he slowly began to dismantle my illusions. He introduced me to a concept pioneered by the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, the idea of entering a session without memory or desire. To truly see a patient, Bion argued, a therapist must strip away their memories of past sessions and their desires for the patient's future progress, simply observing who the person is in this exact present moment. Wendell was turning this lens directly onto me. He was asking me to look at my own life without the suffocating memory of what I thought my future was supposed to be, and without the desperate desire to magically fix the present pain. It was an agonizing assignment. Sitting in the raw, unedited reality of the present meant admitting that the whole package was an illusion. It meant accepting that my life was messy, fractured, and deeply uncertain, and that no amount of bargaining was going to bring the old itinerary back. By the time Friday afternoon rolled around, The sheer weight of holding all these fractured realities became almost physical. The coveted 4 o'clock Friday slot is a unique space in a therapist's week. It is the final hour before the weekend, the moment when the professional facade begins to thin, and the exhaustion of carrying other people's secrets settles into the bones. Sitting in that chair, transitioning from Rita's quiet despair to John's loud deflections, and finally facing my own reflection in Wendell's calm gaze, I realized that grief is never a problem to be neatly solved. It is an entirely new landscape that must be traversed step by painful step without a map and without the comfort of knowing when or if the heavy weather will ever truly break. Chapter 4. Breaking through the defenses. The unconscious mind refuses to be ignored forever. During our waking hours, our psychological defenses stand like heavily armed sentries at the gates of our awareness, meticulously deflecting any painful truths or uncomfortable memories. We build these walls out of necessity, using anger, humor, intellectualization, or sheer busyness to keep the terrifying realities of our inner lives at bay. But when we sleep, those sentries finally clock out. Dreams are the wild, unfiltered terrain where the mind attempts to process everything the waking self stubbornly refuses to look at. In my own therapy, and in the therapy of my patients, the sudden emergence of vivid, chaotic dreams signaled that the heavy machinery of denial was beginning to break down. The truth was bubbling up to the surface, and the therapeutic work was about to shift from a polite conversation into a visceral excavation. I could see this shift happening with John. For weeks, he had treated my office like a courtroom where he was the prosecuting attorney and the rest of the world was on trial. He built a fortress of arrogance, using his scathing intellect to keep me at a safe distance. But exhaustion eventually catches up with even the most vigilant guards. One afternoon, the relentless barrage of hostility simply ran out of steam. He had been ranting about his wife, Margot, and her supposed inability to handle the simplest tasks, when his voice suddenly dropped. The blindingly white smile vanished. He looked away, staring at the floorboards, and the room became suffocatingly quiet. In that heavy silence, the first true confession slipped out. It wasn't a dramatic, tearful revelation, but rather a quiet, devastating admission of profound inadequacy. Beneath the roaring anger at the incompetence of others was a terrified man who believed he was fundamentally failing the people he loved most. The impenetrable armor had cracked, and for a fleeting moment I saw the agonizing vulnerability he had been spending every ounce of his energy trying to hide. I recognized the mechanics of John's hesitation intimately because I was executing the exact same maneuver in Wendell's office. I had sought out a therapist because I was in agonizing pain, yet week after week I kept Wendell at arm's length. I analyzed my own heartbreak for him, preempting his observations and tightly controlling the narrative. I wanted the profound relief of being understood without the terrifying risk of actually being exposed. In the clinical world, a supervisor of mine once bluntly referred to this as practicing therapy with a condom on. It is the desperate attempt to experience the intimacy of the therapeutic encounter while barricading yourself against any real, skin-to-skin emotional contact. You want the cure, but you refuse to let the doctor touch the wound. I was handing Wendell a sanitized, highly curated version of my grief, terrified that if I truly let go, the sorrow would drown me completely. Wendell, however, was far too experienced to let me hide behind my professional jargon. He listened to my endless looping justifications about why my life was ruined and why I was completely powerless in the face of my ex-boyfriend's betrayal. Then, with an infuriatingly calm demeanor, he offered an observation that struck me like a physical blow. He suggested that I was living inside a psychological jail cell of my own making. I was pacing back and forth, rattling the iron bars, shouting at the cruelty of my confinement and blaming my ex for locking me away. The tragedy, Wendell pointed out, was that if I simply turned around, I would see that the cell door was wide open. I was not a prisoner of my circumstances. I was a prisoner of my own refusal to walk out into the terrifying uncertainty of a new life. The bars keeping me trapped were my own familiar narratives, and leaving the cell meant abandoning the comforting identity of the wronged victim. The collision between our carefully constructed internal narratives and the chaotic, uncontrollable external world is where true growth happens, but it is rarely graceful. This collision often occurs in the most mundane settings. For a therapist, the sanctuary of the consulting room is a highly controlled environment, a sacred space where the messy business of the psyche is contained within 4 walls and 50 minutes. But life does not respect those boundaries. Running into a patient in the produce aisle at Trader Joe's abruptly shatters the illusion of clinical isolation. Suddenly, the objective professional is just another exhausted person trying to decide between organic and conventional apples. These embarrassing, unscripted public encounters force both the therapist and the patient to acknowledge their shared, flawed humanity. We are all just stumbling through the aisles, carrying our invisible baggage, trying to make sense of our choices. As the defenses continued to crumble, both in my own therapy and in my work with my patients, a profound realization began to take shape. The crises that bring people into therapy, the sudden breakups, the paralyzing anxieties, the outbursts of rage, are rarely the actual problem. They are merely the alarms. When the smoke clears and the immediate panic subsides, you are left staring at the ghosts of your past. The agonizing pain I felt over losing my boyfriend was real, but its immense, crushing weight was amplified by decades of unresolved family dynamics and old, unhealed wounds. The present heartbreak was just the trigger. The gunpowder had been laid down long ago. Breaking through the defenses means finally saying hello to that family of origin, acknowledging the deep historical roots of our current suffering, and accepting the terrifying responsibility of writing a new ending. Chapter 5. The Messy Reality of Being Human. The therapeutic container is designed to be pristine, a hermetically sealed environment where the messy chaos of the outside world cannot intrude. But the reality is that the walls of the consulting room are entirely porous. A sudden knock on the door from the UPS guy demanding a signature shatters the timeless illusion of the session, abruptly reminding the patient that the person sitting opposite them exists in the mundane physical world. For a fleeting second, the curtain is pulled back. The patient sees the therapist not as an omniscient healer, but as a person who receives mail, pays bills, and participates in the tedious choreography of daily life. This intrusion sparks a desperate, almost primal curiosity. Patients want to know who we are when the hour is up. They scour the internet for our digital footprints, searching for evidence of our spouses, our children, our flaws. I knew this because I was doing the exact same thing to Wendell. In the vulnerability of my own sessions, I found myself intensely hungry for any detail about his life outside those 4 walls. I wanted to tip the scales of our asymmetrical relationship. Through late-night digital sleuthing, I stumbled upon an obituary for Wendell's mother. Staring at the glowing screen, reading the details of her life and her passing, a profound shift occurred within me. My therapist, the calm, unflappable anchor who held the weight of my grief every week, had his own dead mother. He had his own unresolvable losses, his own family complexities, his own heartbreaks. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. It meant that the person guiding me through the dark was also just stumbling through the human experience, carrying his own invisible wounds. We were all just people in a room, desperately trying to heal each other. This shared, flawed humanity is the fundamental baseline of clinical work, but it is tested to its absolute limits when the person on the couch presents a reality that is deeply destructive or morally abhorrent. People do not just come to therapy to cry over broken hearts. They come because they are trapped in agonizing cycles of self-sabotage. Addiction is a ghost that haunts many consulting rooms, and addiction is rarely confined to substances like alcohol or narcotics. More often, it is an insidious dependency on emotional pain. Patients become addicted to the familiar adrenaline of a toxic relationship, the numbing safety of isolation, or the righteous indignation of victimhood. They cling to their suffering because, however agonizing it might be, it is known territory. Healing requires stepping into the unknown, and for an addict of any kind, the unknown is far more terrifying than the poison they are used to drinking. I had to confront the uncomfortable truth that I was fiercely addicted to my own tragic narrative of abandonment, terrified of the withdrawal symptoms that would inevitably accompany moving on. But the ultimate, most agonizing test of a therapist's capacity for human connection occurs when the patient has committed the unthinkable. Sitting across from someone who has perpetrated profound harm, a rapist, a sociopath, an abuser, requires an almost superhuman suspension of personal revulsion. The mandate of unconditional positive regard demands that the therapist look past the monstrous act to locate the shattered, wounded human being beneath. It is a grueling, exhausting psychological tightrope. You must hold the space for their humanity without ever validating their atrocities. You listen to the justifications, the distorted logic, the profound lack of empathy, and you search the rubble for a single pulse of genuine remorse or understanding. It forces you to look deeply into the darkest, most terrifying corners of the human condition and acknowledge that the capacity for extreme darkness exists within the same species that is capable of profound love. Hovering over all of these encounters, the mundane interruptions, the internet searches, the addictions, and the moral abysses, is the relentless, unforgiving ticking of the clock. In therapy, the boundaries of time are absolute. The 50-minute hour is a microcosm of a lifetime. We begin the session with a sense of expansive possibility, meandering through thoughts and memories. Then the halfway point hits, bringing a subtle shift in urgency. Finally, the last 10 minutes arrive, the psychological equivalent of realizing you are growing old. Panic sets in as the patient tries to cram all their remaining unresolved terror into the final seconds. And then, the therapist utters those inevitable words. We have to stop here. It is a weekly rehearsal for the ultimate ending. Whether we are 33 and facing terminal cancer like Julie, or 69 and contemplating suicide like Rita, or simply a heartbroken therapist sitting in Wendell's office, we are all racing against the clock. The messy reality of being human is that the hour always ends, and our only real choice is how honestly we are willing to spend the minutes we have. Chapter 6. The Speed of Want. There is a profound disconnect between the pace at which we live our modern lives and the agonizingly slow rhythm of psychological healing. We are conditioned to expect immediate gratification, next-day shipping, instant downloads, and on-demand entertainment. When we find ourselves plunged into emotional agony, we naturally apply this same expectation to therapy. We walk into the consulting room, sit on the couch, and effectively ask the therapist for the emotional equivalent of a drive-through window. We want the pain removed, the insight delivered, and the resolution neatly packaged by the end of the hour. But the unconscious mind does not operate at the speed of want. It operates at the speed of safety. It will only reveal its deepest wounds when it feels secure enough to survive the exposure, and that process cannot be artificially accelerated. I was acutely aware of this disconnect because my own internal clock was screaming for a quick fix. Weeks into my therapy with Wendell, the initial shock of the breakup had morphed into a restless, agitated energy. Historically, the medical establishment might have diagnosed this feminine anxiety as a wandering uterus, a hysterical displacement of organs causing emotional chaos. But my restlessness was not anatomical. It was an absolute refusal to sit still with my own grief. I wanted Wendell to perform a psychological bypass surgery, to cut out the aching, obsessive thoughts about my ex-boyfriend so I could simply move on with my life. I was doing everything I could to speed up the process, intellectualizing my pain, diagnosing my own defense mechanisms, and essentially trying to outsmart my own heartbreak. But Wendell simply sat back in his chair, refusing to match my frantic velocity. He knew that any attempt to rush through the darkness would only guarantee a return trip. The danger of this restless velocity is that it often masks an underlying panic. When a patient cannot tolerate the slow burn of ordinary therapy, that panic eventually boils over, resulting in the dreaded emergency session. An emergency session is a dramatic rupture in the steady, weekly rhythm of the work. The phone rings at an odd hour, the voice on the other end is tight and breathless, and the carefully constructed container of the scheduled appointment is shattered. When I received a frantic call from John demanding an immediate session, I braced myself for a catastrophe. He arrived at my office vibrating with a furious, volatile energy, his usual arrogant armor replaced by an acute, vibrating terror. A minor conflict with his wife, Margot, had escalated into a terrifying confrontation with his own perceived failures. For the first time, he wasn't complaining about the incompetence of the world. He was suffocating under the weight of his own. In that emergency hour, the frantic speed of his want was a desperate attempt to outrun the sudden, crushing realization of his own vulnerability. My job was not to fix the marital dispute, but to act as a human anchor, holding him steady while the hurricane of his panic blew through the room. While John and I were trying to slow down the internal storms, my patient Julie was engaged in a very different, far more agonizing battle with time. As her secondary cancer aggressively advanced, the concept of the future evaporated. Her speed of want was not about rushing toward emotional resolution. It was a desperate, primal craving for just a little more time. The paradox of dying young is that it forces you into a state of hyper-presence. The trivial annoyances that consume the rest of us, traffic jams, delayed emails, frustrating interactions, were entirely burned away by the harsh glare of her prognosis. Sitting with Julie required a profound recalibration of my own pacing. I had to leave my own restless energy outside the door and enter a space where time was measured in breaths, in the fluctuating numbers of blood tests, and in the quiet, terrifying realization that there would be no long-term resolution. In the face of such profound, unfixable tragedies, the human mind desperately searches for a cosmic logic. We want to believe in an absolute system of karma, a universe where suffering is a direct result of our actions because that would mean the world is predictable and fair. If we do good, we will be rewarded. If we do bad, we will be punished. Patients often agonize over what they did to deserve their depression, their betrayals, or their illnesses. Julie wrestled with this constantly, wondering if some past failure had triggered the mutated cells in her body. Rita, too, was crushed by the karmic weight of her past, convinced that her current isolation was a permanent, non-negotiable punishment for her failures as a mother. But therapy requires dismantling this simplistic arithmetic. The agonizing truth is that suffering is often entirely random. We are not always the architects of our own tragedies, but we are absolutely responsible for how we choose to rebuild in the aftermath. To avoid the crushing weight of this responsibility, we often engage in elaborate mental games, playing endless rounds of would you rather. We torture ourselves with hypotheticals. Would I rather have known the truth and been heartbroken early on, or lived a beautiful lie for a few more years? Would I rather have a life of safe, numb predictability, or a life of passionate, devastating risk? These games are ultimately avoidance tactics. They are a way of negotiating with a reality that has already occurred. In my own sessions with Wendell, I caught myself spinning these webs, trying to rewrite the past to soften the blow of the present. I wanted him to validate my alternative timelines. Instead, he steered me back to the stark, unchangeable facts of the room. The most difficult directive a therapist can give a patient is the command to just be. When every nerve in your body is screaming for action, for resolution, for a frantic escape from the pain, being told to sit still feels like a physical assault. But sitting still is the crucible where true change occurs. Wendell was forcing me to just be with the agonizing emptiness of my cancelled future. I had to sit with Julie as she just was, existing in the terrifying twilight between life and death, without offering her any false, comforting platitudes. And I had to help John and Rita realize that their frantic attempts to control their environments were only prolonging their suffering. Healing does not happen when we finally get what we want at the speed we want it. It happens in the quiet, agonizing moments when we finally stop fighting the reality of what is, surrender our impossible timelines, and learn to breathe in the dark. Chapter 7. Ultimate Concerns and Legacies. In the quiet, heavy atmosphere of the consulting room, patients often believe they are coming to therapy to solve a specific, immediate problem. A sudden divorce, a frustrating career stall, or a paralyzing bout of anxiety. But beneath the surface noise of these daily crises, we are almost always wrestling with something far more profound. The eminent psychiatrist Irvin Yalom identified 4 ultimate concerns that form the bedrock of human anxiety: death, isolation, freedom, and meaninglessness. No matter what is written on the intake form, every person who sits on the couch is secretly negotiating with one or more of these existential terrors. We are terrified of dying. We are terrified of being fundamentally alone. We are terrified by the crushing weight of our own freedom to choose our paths. And we are terrified that, in the end, none of it will have mattered. For my patient Rita, the ultimate concerns were not abstract philosophical concepts. They were the immediate, suffocating realities of her daily life. As her 70th birthday approached, the deadline she had calmly set for her own suicide, the ghosts of her past were closing in. The psychologist Erik Erikson theorized that human development occurs in distinct stages, and the final stage, which occurs in late adulthood, is a battle between integrity versus despair. As we near the end of our lives, we are compelled to look backward and evaluate the sum of our choices. If we can accept our story, flaws and all, we achieve a sense of integrity. But if we look back and see nothing but unfixable mistakes, missed opportunities, and broken relationships, we fall into profound despair. Rita was drowning in despair. She was paralyzed by the belief that she had fundamentally failed as a mother, permanently alienating her children, and that her isolation was a just, irreversible punishment. She viewed her life as a ruined canvas, and she saw no point in continuing to stare at it. The central challenge in therapy is not just identifying the despair, but figuring out how to initiate the agonizingly slow mechanics of human change. Change is not a sudden, dramatic epiphany. It is a grueling, multi-staged marathon. In the clinical world, we rely on the trans-theoretical model of change, which outlines the distinct phases a person must travel through, from pre-contemplation, where they deny the problem entirely, to contemplation, where they acknowledge it but refuse to act, to preparation, and finally, to action and maintenance. The friction between these stages is immense. Rita was stuck in an agonizing loop of contemplation. She knew her isolation was killing her, but the action required to change it, reaching out to her estranged children, risking further rejection, forgiving herself, felt entirely unsurvivable. It is far easier to choose the familiar agony of despair than to risk the terrifying vulnerability of hope. This same terrifying resistance to vulnerability was the driving force behind John's abrasive arrogance. For months, he had been trapped in the pre-contemplation stage, fiercely defending his emotional isolation with a barrage of insults and superiority. But as the defenses slowly eroded, the ultimate concern of death violently breached the surface of our sessions. The tragedy he had been guarding with such ferocity was finally spoken aloud. The loss of his young son, Gabe, in a sudden, catastrophic accident. The revelation completely recontextualized the man sitting across from me. His blinding rage at the incompetence of the world was not just narcissism. It was the frantic, desperate fury of a father who could not protect his child. Parenthood is perhaps the most absolute confrontation with our own lack of control. When you become a parent, your heart essentially walks outside your body, vulnerable to the infinite, unpredictable dangers of the world. John had built his identity on being a protector, a man capable of managing any crisis. The death of his son had shattered that identity, leaving behind a devastating void of guilt and powerlessness. To survive, he had armored himself in anger, punishing himself and his wife Margot because forgiving themselves would feel like a betrayal of their boy. Sitting with John in the aftermath of this confession required a profound stillness. There was no clinical intervention that could fix the loss of a child. The work was simply to hold the space for his unvarnished agony, allowing him to finally weep for his son without the protective shield of his rage. Witnessing the profound, devastating depths of John's grief over his child forced me to hold a harsh mirror up to my own heartbreak. My ex-boyfriend had walked away from our relationship because he could not tolerate the unpredictable, messy reality of living with my 8-year-old son. He had famously cited his desire to simply read the paper on weekends without the interruption of children playing with Legos. In my anger, I had characterized his departure as an act of sheer, selfish cowardice. But as I grappled with the ultimate concerns in my own therapy with Wendell, I began to see the situation with a more agonizing clarity. Boyfriend had not just rejected my child, he had rejected the inherent chaos of building a deeply intertwined human life. A life of meaning is essentially a sprawling, chaotic Legoland. It is loud, it is messy, the pieces are sharp when you step on them in the dark, and it requires constant, exhausting construction. By walking away, Boyfriend was choosing the safety of a pristine, quiet room. He was choosing freedom and isolation over the messy, terrifying vulnerability of connection. I had been grieving the loss of an illusion, the false promise of a perfectly ordered future. But as Wendell gently pushed me to look at the scattered pieces of my own life, I realized that the chaos was not a distraction from the meaning of life. It was the meaning itself. The goal of therapy, and the goal of living, is not to achieve a state of flawless, undisturbed peace. It is to find the courage to sit on the floor amidst the sharp, broken pieces of our legacies and our losses, and slowly, imperfectly, begin to build again. Chapter 8. The Soul and the Goodbye. There is a word in Hebrew, neshama, which is often translated simply as soul. But in the deepest, most spiritual sense, it refers to the breath of life, the animating essence that makes a person entirely who they are, independent of their physical form. In the consulting room, a therapist is essentially tasked with listening for the neshama. You are trained to hear the quiet, steady breathing of a person's truest self, even when their body is failing or their mind is obscured by terror and defense mechanisms. As the weeks turned into months, listening for the neshama became the most vital and the most agonizing part of my work with Julie. Her secondary cancer had stopped responding to treatment. The vibrant, fiercely intelligent 33-year-old university professor who had once laughed with me over a mistaken pajama top was now rapidly losing her physical strength. The heavy, unavoidable reality of death had firmly planted itself in the room, taking up all the oxygen. Yet, as her body diminished, her neshama seemed to expand. The superficial layers of societal expectations, polite small talk, and future anxieties were entirely burned away. What remained was a stark, luminous clarity. Sitting with her required a profound emotional endurance. I had to resist every human instinct that tells us to look away from mortality. When someone is actively dying, the people around them often fail spectacularly in their attempts to offer comfort. The psychology of what not to say to a dying person is rooted in the terrifying discomfort of the healthy. Friends and family, desperate to alleviate their own anxiety, often resort to toxic positivity. They offer hollow platitudes about miracles, insist that the person just needs to fight harder, or frantically change the subject to something light and trivial. This refusal to acknowledge the approaching end does not comfort the dying. It profoundly isolates them. It forces the person who is slipping away to expend their precious, limited energy managing the emotional fragility of the living. Julie felt this isolation acutely. She was exhausted by the relentless pressure to be a brave, hopeful cancer warrior for the benefit of others. In my office, the most profound comfort I could offer her was the absolute permission to be terrified, to be furious, and to stop fighting. We did not talk about miracles. We talked about the logistics of her memorial service. We talked about how she wanted her husband to remember her. We simply sat in the heavy, sacred silence of the goodbye. This daily proximity to the absolute fragility of life began to deeply alter my own internal landscape. When you spend your afternoons walking right to the edge of the abyss with a dying patient, the trivial grievances of your own life begin to look entirely different. This shift in perspective was suddenly put to the test when an email arrived in my inbox from the man who had shattered my world. My ex-boyfriend had reached out, sending a polite, carefully worded message checking in on me. Months ago, this email would have triggered a catastrophic emotional spiral. The old version of me would have meticulously analyzed every single comma, desperately searching for hidden meanings, signs of regret, or an opening for reconciliation. I would have brought it into Wendell's office, waving it like a piece of vital evidence, demanding that we dedicate the entire session to dissecting his motives. But as I sat at my computer and stared at his name on the screen, a surprising quiet washed over me. I did not feel the familiar, agonizing spike of adrenaline. I simply felt a dull, distant sadness. I realized that the man who had written this email was no longer the architect of my future. He was just a person from my past. The grueling work in Wendell's office had finally created a buffer between the stimulus of my ex-boyfriend and my own emotional response. I didn't need to analyze his motives because his motives no longer dictated my worth. The desperate, frantic want had finally burned itself out. The passage of time in therapy is often marked by subtle, almost imperceptible shifts, not just in the patient, but in the therapist as well. One morning, I walked into Wendell's office and noticed that he had stopped shaving. A faint silver beard was beginning to grow. It was a minor cosmetic change, but in the highly controlled, static environment of the consulting room, it felt monumental. It was a stark, visual reminder that Wendell was a living, aging human being outside of our 50-minute hour. He was not a static, omniscient fixture. He was subject to time, just as I was, just as Julie was. The beard was a grounding mechanism, bringing me back to the shared, undeniable reality that everything changes, everything ages, and everything eventually ends. This understanding of inevitable change is what the mind frantically tries to prepare for when an end is approaching. The psychological immune system is remarkably resilient. Just as the body produces antibodies to fight off an infection, the psyche begins to produce emotional defenses to soften the blow of a catastrophic loss. As Julie's decline accelerated, her mind began to engage in a profound, necessary withdrawal. She described it to me through a poignant metaphor about a trip she had once taken to Kenya. When you are leaving a beautiful place, you begin to pack your bags days in advance. You slowly stop looking at the scenery and start focusing on the logistics of the departure. You are still physically present, but your mind is already moving toward the exit. Julie was packing her bags. She was slowly, gently detaching from the beautiful, chaotic world she loved so much. The hardest part of saying goodbye, I realized, is not the final breath. It is the agonizing, prolonged period of packing the bags. It is the buzzing of the bees in the garden that she would soon no longer hear, the books she would never finish reading, the future she would never get to inhabit. As her therapist, my role was not to unpack her bags or convince her to stay a little longer. It was to sit beside her on the edge of the bed, holding her hand and bearing witness to the quiet, terrifying, beautiful transition of her neshama preparing to leave. Chapter 9. The Psychological Immune System. The human body is an absolute miracle of biological defense. When a physical trauma occurs, a laceration, a broken bone, a viral invasion, the immune system immediately deploys a sophisticated, relentless army of white blood cells and antibodies to wall off the damage and begin the agonizing work of repair. The mind possesses an equally complex, entirely invisible apparatus designed to protect us from emotional annihilation. When a psychological trauma hits, our cognitive defenses rush to the scene. We deploy denial to blunt the initial shock, rationalization to bandage the bleeding ego, and anger to cast a protective scab over our paralyzing vulnerability. In the immediate aftermath of a crisis, this psychological immune system is what keeps us standing. But there is a hidden danger in this invisible architecture. Sometimes, in its frantic effort to protect us, the mind builds the walls too thick. The scab hardens, trapping the emotional infection deep beneath the skin, and the very defenses designed to save us end up quietly poisoning our lives. As the months passed in my own treatment and in the treatment of my patients, the initial wounds had stopped actively hemorrhaging. The frantic, breath-stealing panic of my breakup had subsided into a dull, persistent ache. John's explosive, courtroom-style rages had cooled into a heavy, sorrowful quiet. Rita's active countdown to her 70th birthday had paused. We had all survived the acute phase of our respective crises, but surviving is not the same as healing. We had reached a critical juncture in the clinical process, a subtle but profound threshold that marks the difference between counseling and therapy. Counseling is essentially the application of psychological first aid. It is the supportive, empathetic listening that helps a person navigate an immediate transition or stabilize after a sudden blow. It provides coping mechanisms and validates the pain. Therapy, however, is a much more invasive, radical procedure. True therapy requires dismantling the very psychological immune system that kept the patient alive during the crisis. It means intentionally reopening the wound, exposing the trapped infection to the light, and painstakingly restructuring the foundation of the self. Wendell had provided me with brilliant counseling during the early days of my heartbreak, holding me together while I wept over my cancelled future. But now he was transitioning into therapy. He was no longer interested in discussing the daily fluctuations of my sadness. He was pointing his scalpel at the thick, calcified defenses I had spent a lifetime building. He pushed me to examine not just why my ex-boyfriend had left, but why I had unconsciously selected a partner whose desire for unencumbered freedom was destined to clash with my messy, deeply rooted life as a mother. This transition from counseling to therapy is terrifying for the patient because it demands absolute, unvarnished honesty. The psychological immune system violently resists this exposure, often triggering a sudden, fierce regression. For my patient Julie, this regression arrived with terrifying force. As her physical body continued its agonizing decline, The gracious, fiercely intelligent young professor who had bravely packed her bags for the end of her life suddenly vanished. In her place emerged a furious, uncompromising force of nature she dryly referred to as Deathzilla. The burden of dying gracefully is an immense, unfair weight placed upon the terminally ill. The healthy world wants the dying to be serene, to offer profound wisdom, and to absolve the living of their survivor's guilt. But beneath that serene facade is often a roaring, entirely justified rage. Deathzilla was the manifestation of that rage. Julie began snapping at the grocery clerk who moved too slowly, lashing out at her husband over trivial household chores, and directing a blazing, relentless anger at me during our sessions. Her psychological immune system, overwhelmed by the absolute terror of the approaching dark, had flooded her system with pure, unfiltered fury. My clinical instinct, the instinct of a counselor, was to gently calm her down, to soothe the jagged edges of her panic. But the discipline of therapy demanded that I simply let Deathzilla tear the room apart. I had to witness her rage without flinching, without trying to neatly package it into acceptance. Her anger was the truest expression of her grief for the life she was being forced to abandon, and it needed a safe place to burn itself out. While Julie was raging against the dying of the light, Rita was wrestling with the ghosts of the past that kept her trapped in a living death. As we moved deeper into her therapy, the conversation shifted away from her impending birthday deadline and turned toward the origin of her profound despair, her own mother, and her ex-husband, Myron. Our earliest attachments form the blueprint for our psychological immune systems. The way we are mothered dictates the exact shape of the armor we wear into adulthood. Rita had been raised by a mother whose love was conditional, punitive, and entirely unpredictable. In response, Rita had learned to expect betrayal, building a life defined by preemptive isolation. She pushed her ex-husband away, and more devastatingly, she had pushed her children away, unconsciously recreating the very emotional starvation she had suffered as a child. In a session that felt as fragile as spun glass, Rita brought in old letters she had written but never sent to Myron and her children. Reading them aloud, her voice trembled not with the familiar defensive bitterness, but with the raw, agonizing grief of a mother who realized, decades too late, the true cost of her own armor. She had believed she was protecting herself from their inevitable rejection, but she had actually guaranteed it. The realization was crushing. To truly help her, I had to guide her through the agonizing process of forgiving the terrified, damaged young mother she had once been, without minimizing the real pain she had caused. Sitting across from Rita, listening to the echoing legacy of the mother wound, I felt a heavy mirror turning back toward my own life. Every mother sits in the therapist's chair terrified that they are inevitably ruining their children. I carried the agonizing guilt of having introduced a man into my son's life, only to have him walk away, leaving my child to grapple with the instability of the adult world. But Wendell gently, persistently forced me to examine the difference between causing pain and causing damage. Pain is an unavoidable, essential component of the human experience. My son would experience loss, heartbreak, and disappointment, regardless of how fiercely I tried to shield him. My job was not to be a perfect, impenetrable fortress. My job was to be resilient. The ultimate goal of restructuring the psychological immune system is not to become invulnerable to pain, but to become porous enough to experience it, survive it, and remain deeply connected to the messy, beautiful reality of the world. Chapter 10. A pause in the conversation. There is a terrifying precipice in the therapeutic journey that no one warns you about when you first sit on the couch. It is not the terror of digging into the trauma, nor the exhaustion of dismantling the defenses. It is the acute, paralyzing fear of actually feeling better. After months or years of residing in the familiar, heavy architecture of grief, anxiety, or despair, the sudden absence of that weight can feel incredibly destabilizing. When the acute pain finally begins to lift, it is immediately replaced by a new, frantic anxiety, the fear of blowing it. You become hyper-vigilant, terrified that one wrong move, one bad week, or one unexpected trigger will send you plummeting right back to the bottom of the abyss. You wait for the other shoe to drop because living in the sunshine feels far more precarious than living in the dark. I watched this fear grip John as he slowly began to emerge from the wreckage of his unbearable loss. The impenetrable fortress of his arrogance had been entirely dismantled, leaving behind a man who was profoundly raw but finally present. He had stopped demanding that the world bend to his impossible standards and had started doing the quiet, agonizing work of forgiving himself for not being able to save his son, Gabe. As he softened, his marriage to Margot began to heal, shifting from a battlefield into a shared sanctuary. But as the hostility faded, John grew anxious. He was terrified that letting go of his rage meant letting go of his child. In the clinical space, there are strict boundaries regarding physical contact to protect the safety of the container. But in one of our final, deeply emotional hours, as John articulated the quiet peace he was finally beginning to allow himself, he stood up, walked across the room, and wrapped his arms around me. That hug broke every traditional rule of the psychoanalytic frame, but it was the most profound, necessary therapeutic intervention possible. It was the physical manifestation of a man who had finally realized that human connection, with all its terrifying vulnerabilities, was the only way to survive the unthinkable. For Rita, the precipice of healing was tied to a literal deadline. We had spent months quietly defusing the bomb she had planted on her 70th birthday. As the dreaded date approached, the suffocating despair that had defined her existence slowly began to thin. She had done the grueling, terrifying work of writing to her estranged children, not to demand their forgiveness or rewrite history, but simply to take accountability for the damaged mother she had been. The responses she received were not the neat, sweeping reconciliations of a Hollywood movie. They were cautious, distant, and incredibly fragile. But they were responses. They were a tiny, cracked window in a wall that had been solid for decades. Rita realized that she did not have to achieve a state of permanent, unblemished joy to justify her existence. She discovered that happiness is not a constant baseline. Happiness is, sometimes. It is found in the quiet mornings, in the unexpected warmth of a brief phone call, in the simple act of choosing to stay alive for one more day. When her 70th birthday arrived, she did not end her life. She simply woke up, breathed in the air, and kept going. While John and Rita were learning how to navigate the continuation of their lives, I had to face the absolute finality of Julie's. The inevitable phone call arrived, bringing the news that her neshama had finally slipped away, leaving her exhausted body behind. Attending a patient's memorial service is a complicated, solitary experience for a therapist. You hold an entire universe of their deepest secrets, their most profound fears, and their most vulnerable triumphs. Yet to the rest of the room, you are essentially a stranger. Sitting in the back row, listening to her husband and friends speak about the vibrant, hilarious, fiercely intelligent woman they loved, I felt the heavy, devastating privilege of my profession. I had been given the honor of walking her to the very edge of the earth. We had not beaten the cancer, and we had not found a magical silver lining, but we had done the work. We had looked the darkness directly in the eye, and we had not blinked. The weight of these resolutions pressed heavily on my own process in Wendell's office. I had entered his room months ago as a shattered, frantic woman demanding a quick fix for a cancelled future. Now, sitting in the familiar golden light of his office, the frantic energy was entirely gone. I was no longer obsessed with the narrative of my ex-boyfriend. I was no longer trying to outrun the messy, unpredictable realities of my life as a single mother. I had survived the landing in Holland, and I was finally beginning to appreciate the scenery. But as the realization settled in that I was truly okay, the natural conclusion of our work began to loom. Termination is the clinical term for the end of therapy, a word that sounds harsh, clinical, and somewhat fatal. But true termination is not a sudden cutting of the cord. It is a long, intentional process of saying goodbye. It is acknowledging that the therapist and the patient have built a profound, intimate relationship that is fundamentally designed to end. I found myself resisting this ending, searching for new crises to bring into the room, terrified that without my weekly anchor, I would simply drift back out to sea. I didn't want to lose Wendell. I didn't want to lose the one place where I was completely seen and held without judgment. But Wendell, with his quiet wisdom and his slightly more silver beard, gently guided me toward the door. He reminded me that the voice I had come to rely on, the voice of compassion, reason, and accountability, was no longer just his. Over the countless hours we had spent together, I had internalized that voice. I no longer needed to sit in his chair to access it. The goal of therapy is never to create a permanent dependency. The goal is to help the patient rebuild their own internal architecture so they can carry the safety of the consulting room out into the chaotic, unscripted world. In our final session, there was no grand epiphany, no dramatic revelation. We simply sat together, acknowledging the immense distance we had traveled. We had navigated the ruins of my expectations, unmasked my deepest defenses, and found a way to stitch the fractured pieces back together. When the clock finally ran out, I stood up and looked at the man who had saved me from my own despair. We did not say a final, absolute goodbye. In the deeply connected world of human healing, the end of the hour is never truly the end of the work. We carry the people who change us forever. As I walked out of his office and stepped into the bright, unpredictable afternoon, I knew it wasn't a termination. It was simply a pause in the conversation.